Good morning. Now, this is the last unit, last module on the course on semiotics. In this unit, we will mainly study some general ideas on semiotics, and then we will study three important semioticians from three different traditions and their contributions. Romn Jacobson from the Russian formalist traditions, A.J. Gramas from the French Saussurian tradition, and Thomas A. Semioticians from the tradition of C.S. Peirce of United States. But before we take up each of these semioticians, we will discuss some general issues regarding semiotics so as to understand how we can look at the various intellectual traditions of the world for enriching our understanding of semiotics and also for enriching our ideas on the phenomena around us. So, semiotics is an important area of studies which contributes to the overall understanding of objects and phenomena around us by opening us to the structures of events and ideas around us. Various thinkers have contributed in this field since long. Scholars of semiotics have studied thinkers like Pierre, Abelard, St. Augustine, and various other such thinkers. If we carefully study any knowledge tradition of the world, we may encounter such attempts of understanding the world structurally through the language formulations. In the Indian tradition also, we can find such thinkers who have devised ways to structurally categorize the phenomena around us. If we can see the Indian traditions, we may find even the texts on various scientific disciplines doing the same. For example, we can see how texts like Charak Samhita, Sushrut Samhita, Arthashastra and such others have tried to evolve categorization for the study of the facts and ideas they are dealing with in the text. In the Indian traditions, one may find numerous examples of studies of the creation of meaning and its categorizations by simply looking at the literature available under the aegis of various systems of darshana. In the Indian intellectual traditions, we see various branches of darshana dealing with this. And we can see also in the European traditions thinkers like Pierre Abelard, St. Augustine, René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, Condillac, Mikhail Bakhtin and many such others. Just as in the Indian tradition, we see Patanjali, Bhartrihari, Adi Shankaracharya, Ratnakirti, Dingnag and such others. Now here we will take up three important semioticians of 20th century. First, as we have said, A.J. Gramas. He was primarily interested in the aspect of creation of meaning and has applied the structuralist approach to understand the meaning. He wrote two books to discuss this issue, Structural Semantics, An Attempt to a Method, which was originally published in French in 1966, and the second book, On Meaning, originally published in French in 1970. As Vladimir Propp studied the Russian folk tales and structurally categorized the functions in the folk tales, Gramas studied the Lithuanian mythology and came up with some interesting concepts. We will mainly discuss here his concept of semiotic square, also known as the Gramas's actential model. A.J. Gramas has developed the concept of actential model on the basis of Aristotle's concept of a square of opposition in his formulation of logic. According to the concept of Aristotle, there are four types of propositions which are in the relationship of contradiction and contrariness. Based on this, in the history of European philosophy, a square diagram is made much after Aristotle, but it is available to us in centuries. Gramas has basically followed the same model to understand the narratives and thus proposed a similar square with contradictory functions being listed from the narratives. Gramas's semiotic square proposes to take up the contradictory signs and arrange them as follows. You can see on your screen. We can see the square that A and B are opposites. In every narrative, we find such oppositional pairs. For example, the hero and the villain. The minus A is that which helps define A, by the principle of difference as understood by Saussure. Similarly, minus B is that which helps define B by the principle of difference as understood by Saussure. So the relationship between A and minus A are defined by negation. Similarly, minus P becomes the opposite of minus A. We can illustrate this by taking an example of A as a masculine and B as feminine. Now we can see A and B as opposites to each other. Then minus A can be not masculine, that is negation of masculine, which may mean effeminate. Similarly, minus B will be negation of B and thus would mean not feminine, which may mean mannish as a trait of a woman, like a macho woman. Now from this basic four elements, we can find many relationships emerging in the discourse. For example, A and minus P would give us masculine plus not feminine. That is the real hero of the narrative of a folk tale, for example. A combination of B and minus A would give us feminine plus not masculine, which may mean overtly too feminine, which can be a character like a vamp in the narrative of a folk tale. If we mix the relationship between A and B, we can get masculine plus feminine, which may represent a hermaphrodite kind of character in a narrative. Similarly, minus A and minus B, that is not masculine plus not feminine, may represent a character which is asexual, which can be like an angel in a folk narrative. A mixture of B and minus B, that is feminine plus not feminine, may represent a female servant who performs many tasks socially not considered to be performed by a woman. So, briefly, we can say that in the model proposed by Gramas, there are actants and they are identified in these oppositional and negational pairs by their acts as per the functions in the narrative. We should be clear here that by oppositional, we mean the binary pairs, and by negational, we mean the meaning arrived at by paradigmatically distinctive elements. The oppositional pairs are the way of thinking and structurally categorizing the elements present in a narrative, and the negational elements are the application of the Saussurean principle of difference, which says that we arrive at the meaning of a sign by negating the other meanings possible in the context. On this basis, several relationships can be studied and similar relationships can be found in narratives. If we can study the actants of various folk narratives, we may arrive at the list of a few actential categories which through opposition and negations will help us understand how the meanings and perceptions are structured in that particular folk tale, which in turn may further represent the social thoughts and the social structures. Now, the next semiotician we will undertake is from the tradition of C.S. Peirce of United States of America, Thomas A. Semioticians. Now, Thomas A. Semioticians worked basically on the notion of science and was not interested in the discourse analysis like Gramas, Prop, and many such others. He was primarily a linguist and has contributed to the emergence of the field of biosemiotics, which studies mainly the formation and interpretation of science in the study area of biology, that is the animals and the plants. We often hear about the communication between plants or communication between animals, but is there any sign formation process involved in this communication? If yes, then what are these processes? If no, then how does this communication happen? In human realm, we cannot even imagine of a situation where communication may happen without sign formation processes being involved historically. Semioticians interacted with experts in various fields and then initiated such innovative fields where such questions may be discussed and the various communication systems may be studied elaborately. Also, Semioticians edited two important books, the Semiotic Sphere and the Semiotic Web. 1986, and the Semiotic Web has other volumes also later on, 1987, 1991, and maybe others also, in which he invited papers from semioticians of various countries of the world. Though by and large, Thomas A. Semioticians along with John Umiker Semioticians have worked in the same tradition established by C.S. Peirce in USA, Thomas A. Semioticians has done a pioneering work of interacting with the scholars of various parts of the world and have presented the various traditions of semiotic studies as being pursued in various countries and various societies of the world. Unfortunately, India has not been properly represented in his volumes, even though we know that the semiotic studies or the kind of issues studied under semiotics have been an age-old preoccupation, and even in 20th century many scholars have worked in this field. Now we take up the third tradition, the third important semioticians, known as Romn Jacobson. He was primarily a formalist from Russian and Prague school who was interested in a study and creation of meaning in poetic forms, and thus also discussed the processes of creation of meaning in communicative processes. His thought processes can be understood by the fact that as a young man he was primarily trained in the Moscow linguistic circle, whose stated prime aim was the study of linguistics, poetics, metrics and folklore. He studied poetry, and his approach to study poetry can be considered essentially the approach of a linguist to study poetry. He has used the concepts of metaphor and metonymy to understand people. We have already studied his concept of metaphor and metonymy in Unit 2 and Semiotics. He defined in the context 6 functions of language in an act of communication, and here in this unit, after we have studied metaphor and metonymy in previous units, we will take up his notion of 6 functions of language in an act of communication: emotive, referential, conative, phatic, metalingual and poetic. These 6 functions can help us understand various acts of speech in communicative processes. Now, emotive function is performed by the speaker of a sentence. The one who emits the first signal performs the emotive function. Then the next function is referential function, which denotes the references in which the statement has been uttered and in which the statement is being understood. Any plain statement which simply refers to some facts would be an example of this. For example, if we say Delhi is the capital of India, this statement refers to a particular fact and there is no other intent of communication here. Hence, this is a simple, ordinary, plain referential function which is in the center of this act of communication. Whereas when we had talked about the emotive function, it is by the speaker and takes into account the speaker's feelings and location or situation more. For example, if we say, listen, Delhi is still far away, then we are speaking with intention to talk about the location of the speaker or the feelings of the speaker, so the addresser's emotion is in the center, hence it is the emotive function. The third function is conative function, which is performed by the one who receives and understands the statement sent by the speaker who has performed the emotive function. For example, look, there is a star. You see that? Here is the attention of the addressee is drawn by the use of the words look. You see that? So, the function in the center is whether it is being really perceived, what is being said or not. So, the conative function is in the center in this act of communication. Now, the phatic function is performed when the mode of contact between the speaker and the listener of the statement being uttered is emphasized. For example, we say hello to someone. So here the contact is simply being established. For example, if we say good morning, how are you? Now this is an example of the phatic function because it is simply for establishing the contact. It depends upon the mode of contact between the speaker and the listener and whether they are able to establish the contact or not. The next function is metalingual function. It is the function of language in which the sounds are arranged in a particular way to perform the linguistic functions of communication, mainly to establish that the addresser and the addressee understand each other. For example, did you understand the lesson? Or fine, shall we move ahead to the next paragraph? So these are the sentences uttered in order to make sure that the addresser and the addressee are working at the same level in language. Now, when the communication is oriented towards the message for its own sake, the poetic function is in the center. Often in speeches or any such text where the message becomes the main aspect of the communication, we find that the poetic function is in the center of communication. Often with the poetic function, an aesthetic sense is infused in the language or in the communication by using such language which appeals our aesthetic sense by the beauty of the juxtaposition of sounds and words in the act of communication. In fact, mostly in poetry, we have already said earlier that Romn Jacobson was primarily interested in studying poetry and thus arrived at this formalist, structuralist understanding of the function of language and also the concept of metaphor and metonymy. Now, we find that even the expressions apparently falling into the category of other 5 functions of communication play some aesthetic role in the act of communication, thus placing emphasis on the poetic function of the language in the communication process. So, message is the most important aspect as it is that which plays the poetic function, and poetic function is often in the center. And then you can see that the relationship between the emotive and the conative function in the diagram is through referential, poetic, phatic and metalingual. So, emotive and conative functions remain at the center and all the other are the via media through which the act of communication can be defined. Now, once we have understood that the act of communication is centered around various kinds of functions as we have just seen, we can see that in the poetic function we have the possibility of arranging and rearranging the text. Now, this means that there is a possibility of creation and recreation of the aesthetic effect of the text. In fact, the signs in a language can be used without any aesthetic effect. But when they are used to create an aesthetic effect in an act of communication, it becomes an artistic language. And in the artistic language, there is always a possibility that the emphasis is on the poetic function between the emotive and the conative functions. This artistry can be on part of both the poet as well as the reader of the poem, that is a text. Now, you can see that the poetic function is also a function related to the one who is performing the conative function. So, for example, the poems of Omar Khayyam were part of the tradition and did not become an important text until it was properly collected, edited and then translated by Edward Fitzgerald. Here, the role of the reader, who is Edward Fitzgerald, is clearly as important as the role of poet who wrote the text. It is under the edition of Fitzgerald that the text of Omar Khayyam became a literary masterpiece. Similarly, in other forms of art also, the creator of a particular piece of music or painting or a sculpture yields to the aesthetic understanding of those who are capable of appreciating the beauty by recreating the meaning of the signs used in the text while understanding the text. So, in literature and other forms of art, in fact any form of art, a constant and continuous play of language and signs happen, in the absence of which the aesthetic effect of the text may be lost. Semiotic reading of the text emphasizes on this aspect of communication, which is important in the field of use of signs in a particular type of language chosen as a medium of communication for a particular field of art, whether verbal art or visual art or oral art and such others. Now, let us summarize once what we have learnt in this unit. We have briefly studied the works and ideas of 3 important semioticians of 20th century who represent 3 different traditions. A.J. Gramas, the tradition of the French; Thomas A. Semioticians, the tradition of C.S. Peirce in United States of America; and the Romn Jacobson, who represents the Russian formalist tradition. These 3 semioticians come from various parts of the world, and it is to note here that Thomas A. Semioticians has made significant contribution by collecting the articles and the ideas of semioticians across the world who have talked about the various traditions of semiotic studies in various parts of the world. With this brief understanding of the categories and ideas of A.J. Gramas and and Romn Jacobson, you can see that how the structuralist categorization of various functions of usages of language in different situations in act or acts of communication happen. With this, you can apply these categories and ideas on various speech acts in various communicative situations. And in the last subsection of this unit, we have further emphasized on the role of reorganization of signs and functions of language by the reader of the text. In fact, even the creator of the text is a reader of the text. This is beauty of human language, that the creator of the text is equally a reader of the text. Himself or herself, who is the creator also, can distantiate from the text and can become the reader and can become the interpreter of the text. In semiotics, we can emphasize on this aspect of human communication by identifying various signs and their various functions, leading to various communicative intents and understandings of the text. Thank you.